Specialist at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's National Conservation Training Center in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. In addition to hosting broadcasts, I have the honor of coordinating the Native Youth Climate Adaptation Leadership Congress, a week-long on-site program for Indigenous high school youth to grow in leadership skills, which we welcome you to learn more about. Today's broadcast is the first of a very interesting two-part series. But before we get into that, we would like to acknowledge that the National Conservation Training Center is located on the unceded ancestral lands of many Indigenous peoples. While we could not find a full account, we are aware that many peoples traversed, cherished, and lived on this land. They include the Massawamik, the Haudenosaunee, the Shawnee, and the Delaware. As we learn more about the Indigenous people who continue to have relationships with this land, we better appreciate the good earth on which we work, live, and learn. We pledge to grow and sustain relationships with Indigenous communities through collaboration on our training, our outreach, youth programs, museum exhibits, and more. And we encourage others to learn more about the land on which they work and reside. Today, you are going to hear a welcome from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's Regional Director for Alaska, Sarah Borio. After that, Crystal Leonetti, the Alaska Native Affairs Specialist for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, will facilitate the broadcast. Sarah, thank you for starting us off today.
Thank you, Jen, and thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Sarah Borio. I am the Regional Director for the Fish and Wildlife Service in Alaska, and I'm so pleased to be here to help open this Indigenous Connections Roundtable focused on the work of an incredible team up here in Alaska to incorporate Indigenous knowledge into the Alexander Archipelago Wolf Species Status Assessment. I'm joining you today from Dagayakuk, Anchorage, Alaska in Dena'ina country. This assessment could not have been adequately prepared without including the voices of the Indigenous people who have a deep connection with wolf across Tlingit-Ani, also known as Southeast Alaska, the homelands of Tlingit, Haida, and Tsimshian peoples. When my parents, Liz and Tony Borio, brought me and my older sister to Alaska when I was 1 year old, we were welcomed into the Tlingit village of Yakutat. The Indigenous peoples of Yakutat and across Southeast have coexisted with land and wildlife, their relatives, for millennia, and they possess an understanding of wolf that differs from the Western scientific understanding of wolves. They have a profound and ancient relationship with wolves embedded in their language, culture, society, and homelands. They live closely with wolves in these homelands, and because of this, they have a substantial body of knowledge about wolf behaviors and characteristics, trapper experience and insights, and ways of estimating wolf abundance and pack size. I want to express my deep gratitude to the communities like Yakutat who welcome my family and the people there who helped raise me and generously shared their lifeways. I thank them for their past, present, and future stewardship of the lands and wildlife of Alaska. I also want to thank the team here with us today, Dr. Steve Langdon, Dr. Chuck Smith, and the Sea Alaska Heritage Institute, Dr. Jeffrey Brooks for their teamwork and quick action, and for our team, especially Sarah Markegard, for her respect for the Indigenous knowledge and the process undertaken by social scientists and knowledge bearers. And I want to thank our Indigenous research partners, the knowledge bearers who shared their knowledge with us. It is their cultural and intellectual property. In Alaska, we are going to continue to build on this important work in future species status assessments, but also in other planning and engagement efforts. Indigenous knowledge is one of the many important bodies of knowledge that contributes to our collective understanding of the natural world. To forward this work, we recently hired 2 Indigenous knowledge liaisons to help build our capacity and understanding. Thank you all for joining this conversation and for your recognition of and interest in the valuable contributions of the Indigenous knowledge that tribal nations and Indigenous peoples have gained, passed down from generation to generation, and so generously share with us. Thank you.
Liana, Sarah, that was an awesome introduction. Waka, chisgugua, Koyana Dailuchi. Hi, everyone. I said, what's up in my Yupik language. I said, my Yupik name is Jiskuk, and thank you for being here. I also go by Crystal Leonetti, and I'm your Alaska Native Affairs Specialist for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service here in Dagayakuk on the homelands of the Dena'ina peoples. I am happy and excited about what we're talking about here today, what we've been working on for over a year. And I'm going to just turn it straight over to Sarah Markegard, an awesome colleague here in Anchorage, to talk more about the species status assessment process. So, Sarah.
Thanks so much, Chief Cook. Hello, everyone. Thanks for being here. My name is Sarah Markegard, and I work for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in the Ecological Services Program, based out of Anchorage, Alaska, on the traditional homelands of the Dena'ina. I am the lead biologist for the Alexander Archipelago wolf, or AA wolf, as I may refer to it from now on. So I'm going to introduce the study that we carried out to understand Indigenous culture and ecological knowledge as it relates to the AA wolf. And I'm just going to share a couple of background slides to provide a bit of history and context on the topic before we begin the panel discussion. So I'm going to join the panel alongside our distinguished Indigenous Knowledge Study team. Dr. Steve Langdon is a professor emeritus of anthropology at the University of Alaska Anchorage, who's worked with Indigenous communities in Southeast Alaska for decades and has developed a significant level of trust with many members of the Tlingit and Haida tribes. Dr. Jeff Brooks is a social scientist with the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management in Anchorage and has a breadth of experience applying Indigenous knowledge in federal decision-making processes. And Dr. Chuck Smythe is an ethnographer with the Sea Alaska Heritage Institute, which is a nonprofit based out of Juneau that promotes Tlingit and Haida arts, cultures, history, and education. I also want to acknowledge the 9 Indigenous resource experts that graciously shared their knowledge and time with us for this study, as well as Dennis Nickerson of the Organized Village of Kasan and Prince of Wales Tribal Conservation District for coordinating research with the Prince of Wales tribes. So first, a bit of information about the Alexander Archipelago wolf. The AA wolf occurs along the mainland of Southeast Alaska, which is shown in green on the map, and coastal British Columbia, which is in blue on the map, west of the Coast Mountains. So populations also exist on many of the larger outlying islands in Southeast Alaska and British Columbia, including Vancouver Island. The Fish and Wildlife Service recognizes the AA wolf as a subspecies of gray wolf, and this distinct taxon is also known as the coastal wolf or sea wolf due to their association with the coastal temperate rainforests of Southeast Alaska and BC. So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service received a petition to list the AA wolf as a threatened or endangered species under the Endangered Species Act in July of 2020. In 2021, we issued our finding that the petitioners had provided substantial information suggesting that the AA wolf may be warranted for listing. And it's also important to note that environmental groups have petitioned to list the AA wolf under the Endangered Species Act 2 previous times since the 1990s. In both previous cases, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service determined that the Alexander Archipelago wolf was not warranted for listing. At the beginning of 2022, the Fish and Wildlife Service kicked off the Alexander Archipelago wolf species status assessment. Hereafter, I'll refer to this as the SSA to inform the listing decision. And in the process of gathering information on the status of the species, we found that there were important areas where we were lacking knowledge about the AA wolf. Not only that, but after a thorough examination of previous assessments, literature reviews, and transcripts from public meetings, we determined that we were missing an entire information source that was critical for fully understanding the status of the AA wolf, Indigenous knowledge. And I believe that the White House directive from November of 2021 to elevate Indigenous knowledge in federal decisions helped ensure that this was a priority for leadership with this SSA. Okay, so for purposes of our SSA, we focused our Indigenous knowledge study in Southeast Alaska, and we did not include British Columbia due to time constraints. AA wolves have coexisted with Indigenous peoples in Southeast Alaska for thousands of years. And Southeast Alaska, which is shown here on the map, is home to 3 distinct native tribal groups: the Tlingit, the Haida, and the Tsimshian. The Tlingit and Haida were the indigenous occupants in the region when European explorers arrived in the late 18th century. And this map shows the Tlingit Kwans, or socio-territorial units. Haida territories are represented by the Ka'ai-Ani unit, which is shown here in the lower right corner. And the Tsimshian territories are represented by the Metlakatla unit next to it. So due to limited time, we employed rapid appraisal research to develop a preliminary understanding of Indigenous peoples' ecological knowledge of wolves in Southeast Alaska. We applied ethnographic interview methods, and the 9 Indigenous research partners that were interviewed represented 6 large geographic areas and communities in Southeast Alaska, which are shown here on the map. For text analyses, we used inductive coding from grounded theory, and we supplemented interviews with a literature review focused on the cultural significance of wolves in Tlingit society and social organization. And the study was also informed by tribal consultation. So to inform and focus our semi-directed interviews, we first developed a list of knowledge gaps that we were hoping to fill. And those included AA wolf habitat use, wolf distribution, dispersal patterns, and home range size. In other words, how and where do wolves move on the landscape? AA wolf population trends, and also the population trends of their primary prey. And then impacts, both positive and negative, to AA wolves and their primary prey from land use activities, especially timber harvest and road development, wolf harvest regulations, and climate change. And ultimately, the study provided extensive traditional ecological knowledge about AA wolf, and some of those are listed here. And then results also included detailed information on the cultural importance of wolves, relationships between humans and wolves, and the position of wolf in Tlingit social organization. We also learned the primary motive for wolf trapping and hunting is to achieve balanced populations of deer and wolves. Wuch Yak refers to maintaining spiritual and social harmony and includes respect for others and for all things. This is achieved by managing wolves in proximity to communities to ensure adequate deer abundance for subsistence harvests. And all of this information was included in full in an appendix to the species status assessment, and we also incorporated important information throughout the body of the SSA as relevant. Okay, that's all the slides I have, so I can turn it back over to Chiskuk for our panel discussion. Stop sharing.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sarah. I do have questions we're going to run through for the panelists, and they will introduce themselves as we go through these questions. And then we're going to save 15 minutes at the very end for you, the audience, to go ahead and ask some questions as well and interact with the panelists. So write down your questions and have them ready to put in the chat, and we'll do that. We'll transition there in about 30 minutes. So the first question I have is for Dr. Jeffrey Brooks. Jeff, what is the time needed to do an Indigenous knowledge study? And for this particular project, can you describe the timing challenges?
Yeah, Crystal, thank you. And good morning or good afternoon and welcome everyone. I am Jeff Brooks. I work for the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management right now as a social scientist. And this question is very interesting and played a key role in this type of work. I would like to say time is one of our most precious, if not the most precious resource. But it's defined differently by different peoples. So there are different perceptions of time. As much as I would like to say that it takes as much time as an Indigenous community or Indigenous knowledge holders need, what I have to say is, in reality, from a social scientific design standpoint, about 2 to 5 years is what you should be looking at. From a management decision maker standpoint, I would say it's dictated by the regulatory process or the management decision. In this case, we had a deadline of 12 months. But in general, please remember that it does depend on the place, the topic, and the Indigenous knowledge holders with which you are partnering. I hope that answers your question for now, Crystal.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. Dr. Brooks. And the next question I have is for Dr. Chuck Smythe, and if you'll introduce yourself after I ask the question. How does someone go about finding a sponsoring partner? Actually, Sarah is part of this question as well, Sarah Markegard. And what types of expertise are needed by that partnering institution? We'll start with Sarah, and then if Dr. Smythe will introduce himself.
Yeah, thanks, Cook. And I can't speak for other projects because I think each one is unique in terms of the partnerships and the expertise that you need and that are available. But at least for Fish and Wildlife Service employees, I highly recommend working with your regional Native Affairs specialist. So for me, connecting with Chief Cook early on was really critical. She put me in touch with Dr. Langdon, who has worked closely with the Sealaska Heritage Institute, who is our sponsoring partner on the project, on numerous projects, and he recommended that the agreement be set up with them. So really for us, it came down to working within the networks that we already had established to find a good fit. And I'll hand it over to Chuck to describe the breadth of expertise at the Sealaska Heritage Institute.
Hello, everyone. I'm Chuck Smythe. I'm the senior ethnologist here at Sealaska Heritage Institute in Juneau. And I'll go ahead and answer the question. SHI, Sealaska Heritage Institute, is a regional Alaska Native nonprofit educational and cultural organization. Founded in 1980, so we've been working in the region for quite a while. The best kind of organization to work with on this project is an institution which is experienced in conducting and in managing sociocultural research and social science research projects that is known and trusted by tribal communities and cultural experts, has pre-existing relationships with the indigenous groups and individuals and tribal governments, and is known for support of scientific research into cultural traditions and indigenous knowledge. I have a list of types of expertise. I'll go through really quickly, but just wave if I exceed the time. But so this includes managing and administering cooperative agreements, writing research contracts for PIs, providing honoraria for research experts, resource experts, using contracts and invoicing, providing informed consent forms and permissions from research experts, managing research data, including secure retention and archives, and ensuring confidentiality of all the various types of data that are collected, managing preparation of interview transcripts, managing linguistic review, acquisition of permissions for use of photos and other resources in a report, and payments for same, and just providing cultural knowledge and knowledge of various social science research methodologies, and having publication experience, editing and preparing reports for publications and public relations, PR announcements and things like that.
Thank you, Chuck and Sarah. And I will add that the reputation and the trust of Sealaska Heritage Institute and Dr. Langdon, who's going to talk here in a minute, really encouraged the knowledge bearers to provide really rich and important information into this study. So we are grateful to Chuck and our partnership at Sealaska Heritage Institute. All right, and Chuck, I'm going to ask you the next question as well. What expertise does the sponsoring agency look for when conducting an IK study?
Well, we look for a social scientist, which is defined in this case in a more limited way. We're looking for someone with a skill set of a cultural anthropologist or ethnographer who demonstrates an understanding of the ecological and cultural dimensions of the issue or problem, and who has significant experience with the use of interview protocols not survey research, and is capable of probing for more details and following lines of thought expressed by the interviewees, and leads the discussion into key areas that are meaningful in the experience of the interviewees. Also important is extensive field experience with the Indigenous group, what might be termed long-term engagement. We're talking, in the case of Dr. Langdon, 40 to 50 years of experience in these various communities, and somebody who is known and respected and trusted by the Indigenous group, and also who knows the leadership of the Indigenous community.
Perfect lead-in to introduce our next panelist, Dr. Langdon. And Dr. Langdon, if you'll introduce yourself before you answer the question. This question says, what are the possible methods available for conducting an Indigenous knowledge study?
My name is Steve Langdon. I'm a professor emeritus at the University of Alaska, Anchorage. I've conducted a wide variety of research across Alaska, but particularly in southeastern Alaska with Tlingit and Haida people for the last 50 years. Thank you for all of you for coming to participate in this Zoom call today. The question has been somewhat addressed by Chuck and Jeff's response. The time is important. One of the background things that I really want to stress is the importance of the linguistic background, and so researcher must be familiar with the particular linguistic background of the group, because you'll find in there oftentimes critical cultural concepts that are not capable or necessarily able to be translated into English, and that therefore you have to be very sensitive to the manner in which these linguistic presentations of information occur. So language is very important. Background was mentioned in terms of the ethnographic and the oral traditions, which provide the important cultural context that helps to understand and frame critical questions. So there's three basic elements that I would stress in terms of the interaction. First, I believe face-to-face interviews are by far the most important. They should be obviously with people that have been identified, or you are, as a researcher, aware of their expertise and knowledge in regard to the particular topic at hand. Secondly, in the course of those interviews, what you will encounter is that this knowledge is intimate place-based knowledge. That is, people's experiences on the land, and through their narrative. The interviews should allow that narrative structure of their own experiences to flow, as well as more structured protocol type questions for comparison across individuals. Through those particular interview questions, you will identify locational, that is, specific place locations that have to do with the topic at hand. In regard to our wolf discussion, for example, what will come up will be places in things like denning sites, trails, various, and one of the things that emerged as as a new piece of information was what I call kill sites. That is, the wolves' systematic use of particular locations where they drive animals on a regular basis, and one can see that the bones of wolves of prey have been accumulated. So there are locational dimensions, and in the best possible world studies, one has images that can demonstrate each of these locational aspects. Now, the locational aspects are also, and the third element that I would bring forth about the nature of the information acquisition from the Indigenous expert is what I call place-based interviews. That is, that one accompanies the interviewee to specific locales the ones that I mentioned before or other types of locales, because the locations are extremely evocative in terms of bringing out additional kinds of information and connectivity that merely sitting in a room in a face-to-face contact may limit. So that's the end of my not necessarily brief remarks, but those I really want to highlight in terms of being able to access and acquire the Indigenous experts' view as much as possible.
That's awesome, and really important information to hear. Those place-based interviews are critical for gathering important information, so thank you. The next question is also for you, Steve. What are the activities associated with the research? And from the researcher perspective, is it important to conduct interviews on site? And you kind of touched on that in the last one. Oh, you're on mute.
We hit the wrong way on that button. Is to use the network of connections that you have with other people to identify who are specific recognized experts within the topical area. That's a very important activity, is to canvass various different connections that one has in the community and obtain references for the best interviewees. In this case, only a couple of the interviewees were unknown to me before, but I got the recommendations about them from individuals familiar with their expertise. So that's a very crucial part of an activity to engage in, and also to give people a full and clear understanding. They want to know, what is this going to be used for? And what's crucial in that regard is that there are deep anxieties and paranoia about the deliverance of Indigenous knowledge, particularly on crucial mass aspects of existence and subsistence practice in their communities, because of the previous misuse, and that information coming back to be used in various ways that harm them. So making sure that you're giving a full and clear statement about the nature of the use of the information that's going to be requested of them. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Langdon. I have the next question for Sarah. What is the necessity of tribal consultation in terms of gaining Indigenous knowledge?
Yeah, so for our study, tribal consultation helped both inform our study design and also resulted in Indigenous knowledge that informed our assessment for the wolf. Our process was definitely not perfect, and we took away some important lessons about how we could do it better in the future. So first of all, tribal consultation should really take place regularly in advance of planned activities, and ideally well before important decisions are imminent. So successful consultations occur when you have really established relationships between the agency and the tribes. And then also during consultations, I think it's important that tribal leaders and partners are invited to explore what they consider to be needs and priorities for wildlife management in their homelands, and to develop and conduct projects with the agency. So in other words, the agency should think a bit more proactively about consultations and frame them less like Indigenous knowledge gathering missions and more like an opportunity to co-design projects and co-produce knowledge with Indigenous experts. So the objective should really be to apply Indigenous knowledge systems to agency decision-making processes, and not necessarily to integrate Indigenous knowledge into our existing Western science frameworks.
Thank you, Sarah. My next question is for Jeff. How can we work these processes into the required regulatory frameworks? That's a tough one.
Yeah, thank you, Crystal. I suspect by now the audience has recognized that this type of work takes a tremendous amount of time. And there are different dimensions to it, as we've heard. We need time for tribal consultation. That should be first and foremost. It should be robust, and it should happen early and often. During our first tribal consultation that I was involved with for this project, one of the elders on the line spoke on the record that they wanted to see more tribal consultation. So this issue of time also relates to what Steve was talking about with social scientific data collection. So we need time to be in the field with knowledge holders, on the ground, on the land, to see the context, to do participant observation, not just the interviewing, but you need to be on the land talking to people, seeing what they're seeing, having demonstrations, as Steve spoke about, looking at wolf trails, seeing these areas where wolves have killed many deer over the years. So it's important to get out there so that you can do things like photograph the situation on the ground. You can do more robust mapping of things like den sites and pack territories. Time also is a big factor related to the regulatory process. So this study was limited. We started talking about it in late January as far as the TEK part goes. And by March, we were kicked into full gear. And we had to produce our first draft of an interim report really in June, but the real deadline was August 15th. But as you can see, that's not a lot of time if you consider that we need 2 to 5 years. So what can you do? We're going to rewrite all these laws and increase the timelines. That would take a long time and probably a lot of work by Congress. So you have to think the basic bureaucratic response to Crystal's question would be, we need to do a better job of anticipating what is coming. We need to plan in advance, and we need to fund studies 3 to 5 years in advance before an anticipated regulatory process or decision is expected, so that you have the information for the decision makers before the decision is imminent. Okay, so you have to have some things in place ahead of time. We're not going to always be able to anticipate every decision or rulemaking 3 to 5 years in advance. Sometimes you may not be able to get the study that you really need with the Indigenous input that's necessary. So we need to have these relationships and this good practice and record of tribal consultation done ahead of time. We need to have continuous interaction with your Indigenous partners, communities, and knowledge holders so that the groundwork is already in place. In this case, Dr. Langdon's relationship with the communities and the leaders and the key support of Sea Alaska Heritage Institute put a lot of that in place ahead of time. But we need to start thinking further in advance if we want to do this kind of work correctly. I'll end with that. Thank you.
Totally awesome. And when we get to the question and answer period, maybe you can talk a little bit about the article you're writing with recommendations along those lines. And the next question is also for you. What does the analysis of the interviews and recordings, photos, and literature review entail?
So again, we didn't have a lot of time, so we had to do a very expedited review and analysis, basically. So this is part of where Chuck's input about social science expertise is very critical. A researcher ends up with, in this case, long interview transcripts that have been recorded and then transcribed. Those have to be reviewed and read and corrected, in this case, both in English and some Tlingit language, which means they have to go to a linguist, a Tlingit specialist in that language. They have to be, eventually the transcripts have to go back to the knowledge holders for review and essentially an approval that we got it right, that what was recorded is what they want to share. And an analyst like myself in the interest of merging our perspectives, or if you want to call it co-production, the analyst needs to look through and study carefully, and both Steve and I did this in a back and forth way, what the content is, how it fits to the question, the research need, the agency's data gaps, or the agency's project in front of them. In this case, we needed to show the best available information about wolf and its long-term viability in the landscape. So we had to have an eye both toward what the Indigenous knowledge holders were telling us and what the agency was asking for. We had to carefully sort through those. We had to make sense of it and categorize it in sort of a very basic first look qualitative approach. And what I mean by that is for this type of knowledge, it's very much tied to a specific place. And when you do a species status assessment, you're looking at the listed species or subspecies by its range. So it has different parts of its range are considered. In this case, the interviews were set up to cover the wolf's range in different parts of it. So we focused on those areas in 1 to 2 to 3 knowledge holders per area, and we basically sorted out their information by the topic for that area. We did not do an extensive cross transcript analysis where we would look for themes that went across the entire range of the wolf. That is something that is oftentimes part of a study like this and may be necessary. But in this case, because of the nature of the species status assessment and needing to look at wolf in different parts of its range, and the fact that the knowledge is place-based, is tied to the knowledge holder and where they spent their life and experience, we did what I would call a within interviewee or within interview analysis. It takes a lot of time, and then the literature in the ethnographies have to be synthesized and built into it. In this case, in the interim report, we have large sections on the cultural significance of wolf. So it's not just the ecological knowledge and significance, but you cannot take it out of context. So you have to pay attention to the culture and the ecology. And Dr. Langdon very carefully interviewed and picked people who were experts in both. Some of our interviewees were culture experts, others were wolf experts, and some were both. And that's key, because you don't want to decontextualize the Indigenous knowledge and just focus on your ecological knowledge gaps. You need to consider the culture, because that's what makes this so powerful. The way it's connected to the people in their way of life makes the Indigenous knowledge very robust and will aid in decision making. Crystal mentioned an article. We are putting together a manuscript from this work for a special issue of the Journal of Wildlife Management. At the end of that manuscript contains successes, challenges, and lessons learned. So some of the lessons learned are we do need more time for review. You have to go back to the knowledge holders. There has to be a two-way communication process so that people agree that what we're putting out there in this product is reflective of number one, the knowledge that they shared, number two, of the actual realities, because it is social science, and it's also Indigenous science. And, you know, we want to make it accurate. And so it is time consuming, but we learned many things in this. There were a lot of successes and challenges. Most of the Fish and Wildlife Service's knowledge gaps were indeed filled. Others were not. And we did focus a lot on having more time. We will provide the article for you when it's published for more details. Thank you, Crystal.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Brooks. Thanks. For the audience listening, if you do have any questions that you're interested in asking this panel, and there are a few other experts lingering in the background as well to answer questions, please put them in the chat anytime now or in the next 10 or 15 minutes. We can go ahead and field those questions. I do have a question for Sarah, and then I have one for Steve. So Sarah, when the SSA, or Species Status Assessment, was drafted, how did the service gain Indigenous Knowledge resource experts' review of the draft SSA?
Yeah, so this was also a major lesson learned for this effort. The Indigenous experts that we interviewed for the study were invited to participate as partner reviewers for the full species status assessment, which included the Indigenous Knowledge report. But unfortunately, the rigid deadline for the SSA meant that the 30-day review period would overlap with the subsistence fishing season in Southeast Alaska. So that was not ideal. And then additionally, the review was conducted via an online portal to make sure that digital copies of the species status assessment couldn't be distributed outside the selected group of reviewers. But because many of the Indigenous resource experts live in remote areas with intermittent or low quality computer access and connectivity, they faced greater challenges using the portal than other reviewers did. And we did have an option to review a hard copy version of the SSA, but substantive sections of the SSA in the hard copy had to be redacted before distribution in order to safeguard sensitive pre-decisional information. But the redactions then caused concerns about transparency and the sharing of knowledge. And so that likely discouraged some reviewers from providing comments too. So ultimately, none of the 9 interviewees provided comments on the full SSA. So yeah, in the future, I think it's really important that federal agencies are prepared for these situations and have plans in place to make sure that they have review processes in place that are equitable and culturally appropriate.
Thank you, Sarah. And the last one is for Steve. Can you speak about the legal disconnect, which doesn't recognize the human relationship to species, place-based cosmology, and management?
Well, thank you for the question. It's a very significant one, and it harks back to a long history of Indigenous people in the context of these sorts of relationships with governmental agencies. But I want to first mention that in the course of our interviews and our coming to understandings, and certainly carried forward very, very excellently by Sarah into the report and the understandings, is the underlying concept of balance, that the Indigenous, through which the Indigenous experts and their relatives relate to the environment around them and the position. Unlike other cultural systems in the world, the Tlingit and the Haida cultural system sees other co-occupants of our universe as spiritually similar entities, capable with whom it's essential to have relationships, and that relationship is one of respect and balance. However, so that when they construct their understandings, they're not interested in wiping out wolves. They're interested in finding this balance where each of the parties can coexist in the context of their needs and necessities. And so they have very sophisticated models, the Indigenous experts, about all these relationships between human beings, wolves, deer or moose, and the surrounding environment. These are part of a complex model that is used for decision making. And what they note quite distinctly and with some angst, I guess I'll say, is that in the context of preparing a species status assessment, their position does not exist. Human beings, in the context of how these various species interact, are not a part of that species status assessment. How their status as human beings necessarily living in that environment is not part of it. So this is what you speak to in terms of the legal disconnect. And that is a matter of great problematics for Indigenous people. They are therefore once again invisible in terms of the context of this decision-making apparatus, which is this legal framework that is used. and that is very troublesome. And I recognize that it requires legal correction, and the processes that have gone forward have certainly attempted to grapple with that, but that is an underlying deep cleavage, deep chasm in terms of the encounters of Indigenous people with the regulatory processes, not merely in this particular legal context, but others as well. So thank you for the question, and thank you for the listeners for participating today.
Thank you, Dr. Langdon and Dr. Brooks and Chuck and Sarah. That was fascinating. I was fascinated by the entire process as from start to finish, and hopefully we're not finished, and we will continue to build and maintain those relationships in Southeast Alaska with Tlingit and Haida and Tsimshian peoples. As we know, the AA wolf is interconnected with many other species, the land, the forest, the ocean, and that becomes very apparent in the report and in the article that Jeff is working on. So we are open for questions, and I have one question so far. That is, and anybody can answer this, so just raise your hand if you want to answer it. What's one memorable highlight working with Indigenous communities on this project, and why? Maybe one of our endangered species ecological services folks can tackle that one.
I can jump in.
Go ahead. Thanks.
Yeah. Well, I mentioned Dennis Nickerson at the beginning, and he is one of our partners on Prince of Wales Island, which is one of the locations where this listing was most hotly contested, I would say. And he is with the Organized Village of Kathan and is also an environmental planner for the Prince of Wales Tribal Conservation District. And he was a joy to work with throughout this whole process. He was really the one who got us in touch with Dr. Langdon in the first place. He and many folks on Prince of Wales Island know Steve as Uncle Steve. And we learned that in our first meeting with Dennis Nickerson, which he specifically requested that the Fish and Wildlife Service join one of their tribal conservation district meetings. So myself and Carly, who's on this call as well, joined a couple of those meetings right at the beginning, and they shared their frustrations with having their voices not really heard in a meaningful way in previous petitions. There have been two previous petitions to list the wolf, and although there have been public hearings, there's been no meaningful analyses of Indigenous knowledge. And so I really thank him for his efforts to engage with us. I know that was difficult given these historical tensions with the agency. So that working with him was definitely a highlight for me.
I might briefly comment on the question. In the aftermath of the decision that was about the non-listing of the wolf, one of the interviewees who I've known through over the last 50 years, who was part of the Indigenous expert cohort, wrote back and thanked me for the effort that we had done to bring the information forward. And he added this. He said, "Our TEK, the biologists don't listen to TEK from us." This is reminiscent of the kind of circumstance in legal courts in which Indigenous people are often, their expertise is often questioned or unaccepted by the court as being compromised. And this is a very troublesome kind of issue too, is that their straightforward accounts in the context of ongoing processes they feel are not listened to or diminished. So I just want to share that as well.
Thank you, Steve. Yeah. I can tell you that one of my highlights has been watching my colleagues, our scientists, and their reaction to what they have learned from the Indigenous knowledge experts. And I feel like they were like little kids on Christmas morning with twinkles in their eyes as we were hearing from Dr. Langdon, Dr. Brooks, and Chuck some of the initial results coming in from those interviews, because the interviews didn't happen all at once. They were kind of spread out over the period of some months. And initially the litter sizes, the behaviors, some of the alphas are females. Like information like that was very interesting. And just watching biologists Sarah and Leah and Carly and Aaron kind of react to those initial interviews and what we were learning was really exciting for me to watch. So that was one of my highlights. Let's see if we have any more. I do have one coming in from another channel. The question is about how the panel thinks about co-management. And this is Rob Kaler, a migratory bird biologist. He said, I listened to AFN last week and heard some tribal partners want to do their own management and not need co-management. How can the agency be better going forward regarding co-management, and how is that different from co-stewardship? Does anyone want to take a crack at that?
Thank you, Rob. That's a challenging question. I'd like to just start by saying at the end of our interim report, which is not the final document on this, but it's the one that informed the species status assessment. One of the recommendations, and it was a very light suggestion because we didn't talk to tribal leaders or agency leaders about co-management, and we know that it's also can be controversial, but this situation with the knowledge holders, the long-term wolf hunters and trappers in Southeast, and wolf management, particularly from the standpoint of population estimates, it is, in my opinion, is very ripe for discussions on co-management. I think it would be appropriate. The question of Indigenous-led management is, it comes up in this with researchers too, Indigenous-led research. That is a very important topic. It's something that needs to be seriously considered and discussed. It's part of sovereignty and self-determination. All of our work with Indigenous peoples, tribal nations, etc., we need to respect sovereignty and think about what that means and self-determination, and where co-management can work, and where Indigenous partners actually have authority to make decisions and are not just in an advisory role, I think is where we should be going. As far, and that may not work for all situations or places, but the advisory system is important too. And it seems to be doing a good job during certain times and places, but more Indigenous authority for decisions would be helpful in a co-management setting. I'm not really qualified as a non-Indigenous person to talk about Indigenous-led management, but I will say this: North American Indians and Alaska Native people have been managing ecosystems for 10,000 years in here. So given the challenges that we face today with climate change, etc., it's probably the time is ripe to start talking seriously about shifting and sharing power in management decisions. Thank you.
Crystal, just quickly, to Jeff's point, I would point out that oftentimes that the framing of that question by the biological researchers typically is, oh, they want to push us out of the process. What I would look to directly is look at the way in which the tribal governments, the treaty tribes of the Washington salmon fisheries, the way in which they function as tribal sovereigns in making decisions. They have tribal biologists who are hired to conduct research under their direction. So this in no way, shape, or form means denying or putting aside biological research. What it does mean is bringing it under the directive of the tribal leadership in order to accomplish the ends that the tribes feel appropriate to the context, including obviously co-management ones. So thank you for the question.
Well, Cloyana, thank you for all the panelists today. I refer to you all as the dream team, and I think you're setting the bar pretty high. So Cloyana, thank you so much. And I'll turn it back over to Jen.
Thank you all. Thank you all for sharing your time with us today. We really appreciate you sharing your expertise, your knowledge. And we thank all the participants for sharing your time with us as well. And we hope that you can join us next month for the second part of this series. That will be on Wednesday, November 15th at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. We're going to dig a little deeper into this topic and close out the year hearing from Indigenous knowledge holders on their perspectives and being part of this process, which informed the service on their decision-making process on the species status assessment. So closing out the year on the Indigenous Connections broadcast series, hearing from the knowledge bearers, the knowledge holders. So we welcome you to join us. This broadcast, as with all of our broadcasts, will be posted. It's recorded. It will be posted to our website, as well as the draft interim report on this species status assessment. That'll be linked there as well. So if you wish to learn more about this broadcast series, or if you have suggestions for future broadcast series, please email myself, jennifer_hill@fws.gov. And we thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you in November. Goodbye.
Bye. Thank you.